Welcome to the Trailblazer Talks podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Hope Wilson. This podcast is designed to encourage and equip you to be a trailblazer right where you are, to help you discover your God-given purpose and bring you talks each week that will inspire you to do what you were made for. Each week, we will walk through different topics to help you grow in your life, career, and leadership. My hope is that you'll become poised for purpose and walk in that daily. I hope each week you'll feel more equipped to be a trailblazer right where you are. So let's get into this week's episode. Hey friends, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited to continue our church series this week. And this week, I'm sitting down with my pastor, Pastor Brian Cromer, and we talk a lot about local church. We talk about serving in the church and burnout. We talk about what happens when we have church hurt and how to recover from that, and what we can do to have conversations with our own church leaders and to get back into our churches. So I hope that it's helpful for you. And just a caveat that we aren't able to talk about everything that I wish we could talk about, because if we were, we would be sitting here for probably several hours. But I hope this small, short conversation can be impactful and can be a catalyst for you to have the conversations in your own communities, and that it can just stir you to think about things from new perspectives and help you in having the conversations with your own leaders. So without further ado, let's hop on into this week's episode. Pastor Brian, thank you so much for being willing to come on my podcast today. I am excited for this conversation because, one, you're my pastor, and so I'm glad I get to have this conversation with you and not just a random pastor, but two, just because I know you have a lot of wisdom in this area because you have such a heartbeat for the church and the local church and all of that. And so before we hop on into questions and everything, I'd love for people to get to know you. So if you could just introduce yourself and tell the listeners about who you are.
Absolutely. Well, I'm honored to be here. Thankful for you. And I believe in you and I'm proud of you. But to everybody out there, my name is Brian, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the lead pastor at Queen City Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we've been a church now for right at 3.5 years. And I have an amazing family and my lovely wife, Heather. I call her my crown. And we've been married almost 18 years later this month. And then we have 2 little boys. We have Jordan and Caleb. And I'm telling you, we are having the time of our life. I love what I do, where I do it, and who I get to do it with. And you cannot put a price tag on that. So very grateful to be here.
Yeah. Well, as you know, there's so much going on in the church world. And I'm sure you get to have a lot of conversations around just people's thoughts about church, people's heart for church, and also just some of the like pain points too. And I know I have a lot of conversations, and my heartbeat is, I believe church is God's plan A, and I want people to be able to love church and feel comfortable going to a church. And so that's kind of why I'm doing this series, to make sure people know, what is God's plan for church? And also what are answer some of these questions that maybe if they just sat down with their pastor, it would help them to stay in church and not give up on church. And so I figured, what better way to maybe answer a few of these questions than to have a conversation with my pastor that people can listen in on, that can maybe stir them to have similar conversations, or if not, just hopefully encourage them. So a lot of the questions that we're going to talk through today are ones that I've heard through other people. And so I just am hoping that this will be life-giving and just a breath of fresh air for people and help them not to give up. This first question is one that I've heard before, where we have a lot going on in church, and people come, and sometimes there's like the hype of, give your life to Jesus. But I think we also want to make sure people are retaining their relationship with Jesus. So how do we make sure people are not only just accepting Jesus, but also continuing to build and grow in their relationship? And how do we do a good job of discipling them and keeping them engaged?
Yeah. And Courtney, that's a great question. That's something that I know I think a lot about. I think as a team, our leadership team thinks a lot about how can we just not create moments for people to give their life to Jesus, but how can we help people have a real, lasting, consistent relationship with Jesus? And even in my story, I grew up in church. But even like in the best way I can describe it is I knew a lot about God, but I never had a relationship with God till much later in life. And so much of my church experience was about rules, regulations, do's and don'ts. And, at the end of the day, it was about like behavior modification. And it was a big part of my life, but it was a very compartmentalized part of my life. And I remember just growing up and I went through this phase where I knew that there had to be more. And so actually, in fact, our church is built on this idea that there is more to life and God and church than what we can even possibly imagine. And so I feel a heavy burden to not just create environments where people are inspired to make a decision to be a Christian or to give their life to Jesus, but like, how can you walk that out? How can we make it not just a Sunday or an experience or a service? And I think one of the ways that we try to intentionally do that is to paint a picture of what this actually is. And that I think a lot of times it can get even painted in a way where like, follow Jesus and you'll never have to go through anything hard. And that's just not true. And that's just not what even God's word says. Jesus himself says, in this world, you will have trouble. It's actually a promise in the Bible that life is going to be hard. And in fact, me and my wife, we have this life verse, and what we really feel like is our message as a family. And it's at the end of Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus is preaching this amazing sermon. And he ends it by saying, there's two types of people in the world, people that build their house on rock and people that build their house on sand. And he goes on to explain that he is the rock and that everything else is sand. But then it says that rains come and the storms of life come on both houses. So it doesn't matter what you build your life on. We all experience storms of life, but those that build their house on the rock, that their house actually stands. So I'm passionate about helping people not just decide I want to build my house on the rock, but how do I build my house on the rock? How can I have not just religion, but a relationship with God? Because we even believe, and it's even a part of our mission, is that a relationship with God just gets better and better. It never goes in reverse. So year 2 is better than year 1. Year 3 is better than year 2. Decade number 2 is better than decade number 1. And so I think that there's a lot, and we can get into the weeds of like how to be able to do that and how can we do that on an individual level. How can we, I think a lot about, Courtney, is like the church is so important, but I don't want people to be so dependent upon the church to have a relationship with God. It plays a role in it, but it is not entirely the whole thing. So how can I teach? It's like, that phrase that, you can give a man a fish or you can teach a man to fish and then he can feed himself for a lifetime. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to help people know how can you be able to have a relationship with God where church supplements that, but it is not it's not the only way that you can have it is through church and through listening to preachers or, through that. It's like, no, you were designed to have a personal, intimate, one-on-one relationship with God. And we try to help people figure out how to actually do that in 2022.
I love that you said that, because I think that that's what the differentiator is I think a lot of people do, I think they think, oh, I'm going to go to church and that's where I get to know God and that's the only place. But I think sometimes they forget that there's a lot of personal work that we have to do. And there is that personal side of the relationship where that's the differentiator, is doing the work, being in God's word. Absolutely. And doing kind of the different like spiritual disciplines that help you build that relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. And think about this. Think about my relationship, like with my wife, Heather. If my relationship with Heather was only in public settings with a bunch of people around, I don't know if we would have a very close, intimate relationship. But I have a close, intimate relationship with my wife because there's a lot of things that we do one-on-one. And what's cool is that, like in the Bible, it talks all about knowing God. And in the original Greek, that word know is this word gnosko. And it's a very intimate term. It's not a head knowledge, it's a heart knowledge. It's that you just don't have this head knowledge of who God is, but you have this close, intimate, daily, real relationship with him that you can know God.
Yeah. And I think too, kind of with that dependence on the church, I think there's kind of big conversations around how do I find the right church, how to find the right community to get involved in. And, people who may have previously been hurt by the church, trying to reintegrate and finding a new church. Any thoughts or help with people finding a church for them?
Absolutely. I would say this just to anybody that is listening that has been hurt by church. Let me just represent church leadership. Let me represent pastors. Let me represent anybody in leadership, and just let me say that I'm sorry that for what you went through, for what you experienced, maybe for what was done, maybe for what was said. I believe with all my heart that the church is a Jesus-inspired, given, perfect vehicle that is driven by imperfect people. And I know that it's so easy to attach things of God and things of Jesus and even things of the church to the people that have led churches, and on just who are messy, broken, imperfect people. And so I just know for me, I make a decision. I'm going to lead very humbly, realizing man, I'm broken. I'm messy. I make mistakes. And I want to be quick to admit that and be able to do that. And so just for anybody that is listening that falls into that category of, man, I've experienced significant church hurt. Let me just represent church leadership and say, I'm so sorry. I know that was not God's intent. And, but also at the same time, let me put on a pastor hat and let me just encourage everybody that a relationship with God, like man did not establish church, God did. So it plays a role. And even church is not a building, it's people. It's people. And the Bible says that when you are planted in the house of the Lord, in Psalm 92, it says you'll flourish. And I can tell you just as a pastor that my dream for our city and our influence and that we are called to be able to steward is that every single person that is in our city, I pray every day, Courtney, that they would be planted in a life-giving church. It does not have to be ours. There's a lot of amazing churches in our city, in our context, but I pray that people are planted because I want people's lives to flourish. And I believe that happens. I've seen it happen. I've experienced it happen. I know that there can be bad experiences, but I also know that there can be some amazing experiences that can change people's lives. And so I would just encourage anybody to be able to get planted and, to where you put down roots, where you're not just a consumer, but where you're a contributor, where it's like, no, this is my church. I'm connected. I'm involved. I know people. I'm helping. I'm contributing. I'm using the gifts that God's given me to help contribute what's happening here. And I think that there are a lot of different ways to do that. If it's like, well, where do I start? How do I, there's tools like Google to where you can find some different places. But, I think so much of it is relationships. So to be able to say, okay, who do I feel relationally connected to? I also would say this. I think one of the biggest things of like, where can I get planted is where I feel called and connected to the mission of that organization, not just the style, not just I like that song or I like how that dude preaches and I don't like that, so I'm not going to do that. I think more is like where there's a mission that this church has. And I can be a part of that, because the mission isn't just for the pastor or the leadership teams. It is for the church. And so I'm a big on like being very mission driven when it comes to that decision. And that's why you have to be able to get to know somebody's mission, not just their style.
And I think that helps too, at the end of the day, if you connect with that mission, there's no such thing as a perfect church, like you said earlier, because they're made of imperfect people.
Absolutely.
And I think that something that's helped me,
messy.
Yes. And I think something that's helped me is coming back to, you always say this, like, know your why, and coming back to that. So I think that mission is an important part of a church to know, do they align in those ways? And can you fall back on that if you do get hurt, or can you come back to church and keep trying? And speaking of like getting involved in a church and all of that, I know that a lot of times we get really excited and we want to jump on a team, or we jump on a lot of teams. And I have seen this happen before too, where sometimes we get burnout because we got a little over involved and we felt maybe like we fell through the cracks, or that we weren't as cared for as we had expected. And I think it comes down to that same thing with that you talk about, closing the gap with expectations and reality. What can we do, or how can we help people with understanding how to kind of recover from burnout when it comes to serving at church, and not walking away from that just because they were burnt out, but having that season to still be involved in that church without feeling burnout? Yeah,
absolutely. I think a few things. One is to recognize the reality of your experience and not to bury it, and not to, try to, explain it or justify it or anything. It's like, no, like this is what I experienced. And I think there's so much power in being honest. And I think that there is a appropriate way to do that. And I think it's so helpful. At least, I desire to lead a church where that honesty is always, I think the greatest gift I can give down in our organization and our church is clarity, but the greatest gift up is honesty, because your perspective matters, and it should. And I know at least in every person's perspective, it matters. And we can't get the full perspective until we know everything. So I think it can be very easy to be, I'm just going to stuff that. And I think so much of the unhealth that can come is not just in this area, but any area of your life, is when you have secrets or you have things that you've put in the dark corners of your life. And I think there's so much freedom and healing that can come from just taking something that's in the dark and putting it into the light. And so I would always encourage somebody to do that, and to share your experience with leadership, and not in a way to want anything outside of just, hey, I care about this place and I care about this church. And I want to make sure that my experience is just at least heard. And then with the idea of, I don't want other people to experience this. And a lot of times, like I always tell people, man, I can't fix what I don't know. I just can't. And honestly, I think it's a pretty unrealistic expectation for me to be able to fix something that I don't know, because I am not God. I do not know everything. I do not know everything that's happening. And that's why I love being able to receive that type of communication, because then what it can do, especially if it's brought in humility, is to be able to say, okay, now I can understand a little bit more from the other side as well. I'm like, oh, okay, that brings so much more comfort to me, knowing that was the case. And now it's like, okay, I'm convinced 2 chairs and a closed door can fix a whole lot of things in this world. And of like people that know, like, man, I am for you. It's not us versus them. It's like, we're on the same team, and we want to move forward together. And so, I think that's an important part. We teach our kids right now. It's actually one of the 7 habits of highly effective people. I'm just like, seek to understand. And it's like, hey, I want to come and have a conversation where help me understand. And I want to be able to just share my perspective so you can understand what that is. And then that allows a perfect vehicle driven by imperfect people to get better. And I know I, as a pastor, as a leader, but more than that, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, as a follower of Jesus, as a communicator, I want to get better all the time. Like I'll never arrive. So those conversations help so much. And so I think that's how I would express that for somebody that maybe has experienced that, and how to be able to kind of continue to go back into, okay, how do what is it? I think Einstein, he says, doing the same thing, expecting a different result is the definition of, insanity? So something like that. So Google it. It'll be there.
Yeah. And I think that ties in well with my other question about pastoral care, because I think there's so many different types of churches, and every church seems to do pastoral care differently, that I think sometimes people come from one church to a new church and they don't really know what to expect expect for pastoral care. And sometimes it's through small groups or sometimes it's through pastors. And I know like with our model of church, I mean, it wouldn't be possible for you to meet with every single church member. And so we have a structure for that. What are some, and sometimes there's a gap on the church attenders side where they don't understand how they can receive pastoral care. How can we kind of fill those gaps and make sure people feel cared for in the hard moments of life?
Yeah. And because I think maybe I just am optimistic. I don't consider myself an optimist. I consider myself a realist. And I believe that almost every single church out there, if you said, here's some truth serum, take it. Do you care about the people in your church? 100% will say, absolutely. Yes, do that. But like what I've also learned is that perception is reality in this seat. And if people don't know that, or they don't believe that, or they're not experiencing that, that is their reality. And so it's so important to be able to do that on both sides. For do you have the systems and structure to be able to handle pastoral care? Because essentially that is one of the most, and honestly, it's why I believe like you need more than just online church, because who do you call on your bad day? Who do you call when everything goes crazy and you experience crisis and do that? Like there has to be some level of connection with other people. And, I think on the church side, it's systems, it's training. Are we training our people how to do that? Do they even know that is an expectation of a group leader? Okay, we want you to step in and to be able to help in those areas, or somebody that is on the leadership team that leads a group of people that are maybe serving. Hey, that's another great pastoral care opportunity. It's more than just, hey, we want to greet people at the door. It's like, no, when somebody that is a greeter that does that, man, you step in and you help and you communicate that up and you make sure that people are aware and all those type things. But then I would also say when it comes to people within the church, that especially if it's new, I always encourage people like to go in with their eyes wide open, because it can be this unrealistic expectation of relationship, like right off the bat. And I always just encourage people like to embrace the awkward, because every new relationship that you have is awkward. But if you think about your best friends in the world, probably the first time you met them, and that's not what the relationship was. It took time to be able to get there. And so like, I think if we are aware of that, then it's like, okay, I'm cool with that being a little bit of a process. I'm understanding that it's a little bit of process because it's been consistent throughout my entire life. Every relationship I've had, it takes a while to get to where it feels close, where it feels like, man, I know that they know me and they know my heart and they know, people checking on me and all those type things, but essentially so much of pastoral care is relationships, and relationships, like all of them, they take a little bit of time. And so we have systems set in place to maybe help with them initially. But what my dream is that like, man, I've gotten so connected in community with friends, with, groups that I'm in, teams that I serve on, that like when something happens in my life, there is 50 people that are praying for me, checking on me, bringing me food, crying with me, texting encouragement, whatever the case is. And then if that happens to be somebody that's on, and if I know them, that absolutely will happen. But, I think to be able to scale that's really important, because it is, people matter. And we all need to be cared for, and we need to do a great job. And, but like anything, I think it's really important to have grace at the table too.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Well, any final encouragement you would leave for just whether it's church leaders and church members, just with everything going on in today's culture and just with church to help them not give up on leading a church and help them not give up on leaving a church?
Yeah, I would say this, Courtney, I think right now in today's culture, and I've thought a lot about this, that there has been a series of very public things that have been brought to light in the church. And this is not the only time. If you study history, that's something that's been, and I will never minimize those things, because on the other side of those are people that have been hurt, that have experienced pain, confusion, that's led to questioning faith and what I believe and all those things. And those things are very real. And I can tell you that I'm even encouraged by those things coming to light, because I believe that when things come to light, great things can happen, even if it's tough at first. But I would also encourage people that while those things are very real, for every one of those stories, there are thousands of stories that are not being told, that are not loud right now, of churches that are being faithful, that are making a massive difference, and great leaders and pastors that are making a difference in what God has called them to do. Some of them are in small churches, and but just that for everyone, that is very real. And I'm not minimizing those ones, but there are thousands of others. And I think I've just been reminded of the fact that the church is resilient. It just is. And I think that's because it's not dependent upon us. Matthew 16, Jesus says, I will build my church, and even the gates of hell will not be able to. The church I build is unstoppable. And I just am reminded of that it is not my church. It is Jesus's church. I have the honor and privilege of being able to serve Jesus's church. And I don't build it. He builds it. Upon my rock, I will build my church, is what he says. And, I've thought through a lot of what is my response to this. I've shared that. I've had many conversations, one-on-one conversations, public conversations where people have asked me, hey, can I process this with you? And just a few things that I would say is I've made a decision. I will show the kind of grace and mercy I pray I someday never need. And if I'm going to err on the side of something, I'm going to err on the side of that. And so I realize of who I am without Jesus, and my life has been changed by the grace of God. And there are very real consequences to choices that are made, but the grace of God still applies to all. And, if I'm going to err on the side, man, I'm going to err on the side of grace, and also believe in the true side that there is consequences and there's all those things. But that's just important to me. Those are things that I've just been really thinking a lot about. And I hope that those encourage people.
Yeah, I think they definitely will. Well, thank you so much for just having this conversation with me today. I feel like it's really going to help people with, one, being able to have the words to have the conversation with their own pastors or church leaders, and two, just hopefully help them see that grace side and that heart of God of, it takes two people in the conversation to be able to move the church forward, and that humans make up the church, and God has a plan for the church, and to not give up. So I really appreciate you talking with me, and I thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
I hope this conversation was impactful for you. I know that it was helpful for me, and it gave me some different perspectives and helped me to see the heart of the church even more. And if you haven't, make sure to download the conversation guide that is part of our email list. You can do that in the show notes, because this guide will help you with having conversations in your own community, and also being able to evaluate some things for yourself as well. Next week, we will be continuing the church series, so I can't wait for that. If you're not already, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. And if you have any questions, I would love to hear them at hello@thetrailblazerjournals.com. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you back here next week.